At Thanksgiving dinner, my mother smirked over her crystal glass, declaring that they had finally sold my grandmother's house and I was officially cut out of the money. My sister laughed, claiming I would only waste it anyway. I took a slow sip of my wine, smiled, and told them I hoped they would enjoy the cash considering I was the one who bought the property. The entire table went completely silent. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member. My name is Natalie. I am 33 years old and I am the founder of a boutique commercial real estate investment firm. For my entire life, my family treated me like a disappointing afterthought. We were gathered around a massive mahogany table in my parents' Connecticut mansion. The dining room was suffocatingly warm, smelling of roasted turkey and expensive perfume. My mother, Catherine, sat at the head of the table, wearing a designer dress she had bought specifically to outshine everyone else. Next to her sat my father, William, a man who measured human worth strictly by bank account balances. Across from me sat my older sister, Brittany, the undisputed golden child, and her husband, Winston. Winston is an African-American wealth manager on Wall Street, a man whose expensive tailored suits hid a deeply arrogant personality. Catherine tapped her silver fork against her wine glass to demand our attention. She looked directly at me with a cold, triumphant gleam in her eyes. "I want to make a special toast to Winston," she announced loudly. "Thanks to his brilliant financial connections, we finally closed the sale on Grandma Rose's estate yesterday. It was a completely seamless transaction. And Natalie, since you chose to skip the family meetings regarding the estate, your father and I decided it was best to exclude you from the proceeds entirely. You were never in the will anyway, so we are just formalizing reality." Brittany let out a high-pitched laugh and tossed her blonde hair over her shoulder. "It is for the best, honestly," she chimed in, reaching over to squeeze Winston's hand. "If you got a cut of that money, you would probably just blow it on another one of your pointless little startup ideas. You do not understand how real wealth works. Leave the big girl finances to Winston." I did not react immediately. I placed my fork down on the fine china plate, picked up my wine glass, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I looked at the smug faces of my mother, my father, and my sister. They were so incredibly certain of their victory. They had spent decades tearing down my confidence, treating my real estate ambitions as a laughable hobby while pouring all their resources into Brittany. "That is wonderful news," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I genuinely hope you all enjoy that cash, especially since I am the one who bought the house." The clinking of silverware stopped. Catherine frowned, her perfectly manicured eyebrows drawing together in confusion. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. William let out a booming, condescending laugh that echoed off the dining room walls. "Do not be ridiculous, Natalie," he scoffed, waving his hand as if swatting away a fly. "Stop bluffing for attention. We sold the property to an anonymous corporate buyer. It was a Delaware limited liability company, a massive commercial developer. You do not have that kind of capital. You never will." I did not raise my voice. I simply reached down into my leather briefcase, resting beside my chair. I pulled out a thick manila folder and casually slid it across the table, right past the roasted turkey and the cranberry sauce. The folder stopped directly in front of William. "You mean Apex Heritage Holdings?" I asked smoothly. "You should really read the ownership declarations on the final page of those closing documents, Dad. I am the sole owner and chief executive officer of that Delaware limited liability company. I bought Grandma Rose's house." William snatched the folder and flipped it open. His eyes darted rapidly across the legal text. I watched the blood drain from his face as he saw my authorized signature stamped on the bottom line. He dropped the papers as if they had burned his fingers. Brittany slammed her hands on the table, knocking over her water glass. "You are a thief!" she screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical. "You manipulated the sale to steal our inheritance. You have always been jealous of me." I turned my gaze to my sister, my expression turning to ice. "A thief?" I asked, leaning forward slightly. Do you mean like when you and Mom drained my entire college savings account to pay for your six-figure destination wedding in the Bahamas? You forced me to work 3 separate jobs just to pay my basic tuition while you sipped margaritas on a private beach. I did not steal anything today. I legally purchased what Grandma Rose always wanted me to have before Mom forced her to change the paperwork. Catherine opened her mouth to yell, but before she could speak, a strange sound broke the tension. It was the sound of ragged, panicked breathing. I looked over at Winston. My brother-in-law was staring at his smartphone beneath the edge of the table. His dark skin had turned a sickly shade of gray. His hands were shaking so violently that his phone rattled against the wood. He swallowed hard, his eyes wide with absolute terror. "Wait!" Winston stammered, his voice cracking entirely. He looked up at me, his arrogant facade completely shattered. "Natalie, if you are the buyer, why has not the $1.5 million hit my brokerage account yet?" "The Internal Revenue Service froze it today for wire fraud." I smiled coldly. Winston stared at me, his jaw working frantically but producing absolutely no sound. The heavy crystal goblet slipped from his sweating fingers, hitting the edge of the mahogany table and sending a violent splash of dark red wine across the immaculate white linen. It looked exactly like blood spreading across a pristine canvas. Brittany was on her feet in an instant. Her heavy wooden dining chair screeched violently against the polished hardwood floor, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. She lunged across the corner of the table, knocking over a silver candlestick as she grabbed Winston by the lapels of his custom Italian suit. "What fraud!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling of the dining room. "Winston, look at me right now. What fraud is she talking about? Where is our money?" Winston could not meet her eyes. He tried to peel her perfectly manicured hands off his chest, stammering something pathetic about a bank error, a simple misunderstanding with the international routing numbers. But his excessive sweating and rapid, erratic blinking told a completely different story. The sheer panic radiating from him was palpable, filling the room with a sudden suffocating tension that tasted like copper in the air. "Stop it!" Catherine barked, rising from her chair at the head of the table. She smoothed the front of her designer dress, attempting to reclaim her usual absolute authority over the family dynamic. She pointed a trembling diamond-clad finger directly at my face. "Natalie, this is another one of your malicious, attention-seeking stunts. I do not care what sort of computer trick you pulled to freeze that transfer. You will pick up your phone right now, call the bank, and unfreeze those funds immediately. Do you hear me? You will fix this before you ruin your sister's holiday." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms and studying the woman who had spent my entire life treating me like a stray dog she was occasionally forced to feed. The sheer audacity of her command was almost amusing. "Call the bank," I repeated, letting a dry, humorless laugh escape my lips. "You think I have a magical red phone connected directly to the federal government. That is not how federal audits work, Mom. I do not control the Internal Revenue Service. They act on their own authority when they detect massive financial irregularities crossing state lines." I took another slow sip of my wine, savoring the absolute silence that had fallen over my side of the table, while Brittany continued to aggressively shake her husband on the other side. "Fix it!" Catherine demanded again, slamming her hand flat against the table with enough force to rattle the silverware. "You work in commercial real estate. You know these banking people. Call whoever you need to call, leverage whatever favors you owe, and clear Winston's name. We are a respectable family. We do not deal with federal investigations." "A respectable family," I echoed, keeping my tone dangerously calm and entirely devoid of sympathy. "That is hilarious coming from you. Let us talk about respect and fixing things, shall we? Do you remember when I was 22 years old? I came to you with a meticulously researched business plan for my first property flip. I needed a mere $20,000 cosigner's signature to secure a small business loan. Just a signature. I did not even ask you for the actual cash. I just needed you to believe in my potential." Catherine's eyes darted away toward the hallway for a fraction of a second. "That was an entirely different situation," she muttered dismissively. "No, it was not," I countered sharply, refusing to let her rewrite history. You laughed right in my face. You sat in this exact same dining room drinking your expensive wine, and you called me a delusional dropout. You told me that I lacked the intellect for high-level finance and that you would never risk a single penny of your pristine credit score on a destined failure. You told me to go find a minimum wage job and leave the real money to professionals like Winston. I gestured widely toward Winston, who was currently hyperventilating while his wife screamed directly into his ear. Well, take a good look. There is your professional. William, who had been sitting frozen in shock since I dropped the ownership papers, finally found his voice. His face was flushed a dangerous crimson red, a stark contrast to his suddenly pale lips. Natalie, what exactly did your firm find? Tell me right now without the riddles. I shifted my gaze to my father. He had always enabled my mother's cruelty, always deferred to her obvious favoritism because it was easier than fighting her. Now he looked like a man standing on the edge of a crumbling cliff. My acquisition team performs rigorous due diligence on every single commercial and residential asset we purchase, I explained, dropping my voice to a razor-sharp whisper that commanded the entire room. When we initiated the purchase protocols for Grandma Rose's house, my forensic accountants found something incredibly interesting buried deep in the public county records. Someone had placed a silent secondary lien on the property 6 months ago. William frowned, his thick eyebrows knitting together in deep confusion. A lien. That is completely impossible. Rose owned that house outright for 40 years. There was no mortgage. There was absolutely no debt attached to that deed. Exactly. I smiled, the expression not reaching my eyes. That is precisely why it was the perfect target for a fraudulent collateral pledge. Winston used his position as your trusted family wealth manager to access the property deeds. He forged the necessary authorization signatures and quietly leveraged Grandma Rose's paid-off house to secure a massive short-term loan from an unregulated shadow lender in Chicago. Brittany stopped shaking her husband and whipped her head around to stare at me, her eyes burning with pure hatred. You are lying, she spat, her chest heaving. Winston makes 7 figures a year. We have unlimited credit. We do not need loans from anyone. You clearly do not look at your own bank accounts, Brittany, I replied smoothly, enjoying the rapid destruction of her perfect facade. Winston has been day trading on massive margins behind your back. He took incredibly heavy losses in the tech sector last quarter. He needed liquidity immediately to cover those margin calls before his brokerage liquidated his entire portfolio. He illegally used Grandma's house as his own personal automated teller machine. When my holding company initiated the cash transfer to buy the house, the clearing algorithms flagged the contradictory lien. The system automatically triggered an alert to the federal authorities for suspected wire fraud and grand larceny. Winston buried his face in his trembling hands, letting out a pathetic, muffled groan that sounded like a dying animal. Catherine gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning completely white. Winston, she said, her voice shaking with a toxic mixture of rage and terror. Tell me she is lying to us. Tell me you did not forge legal documents to mortgage my mother's estate. Winston just sat there, rocking slightly back and forth in his expensive chair, refusing to answer her. His silence was the loudest confession anyone in that room could have ever made. William was not looking at Winston anymore. He was staring blindly ahead at the floral centerpiece on the table. His breathing had become dangerously erratic, shallow, and fast. He reached up with a trembling hand and grabbed the fabric of his dress shirt, clenching his fist right over his heart. "Dad?" Brittany asked, her voice dropping its shrill, arrogant tone replaced suddenly by genuine, unadulterated panic. "Dad, are you okay? What is wrong?" William did not look at her. He slowly turned his head, his neck moving as if the joints were rusted solid. He locked his wide, terrified eyes with his son-in-law. The sheer horror radiating from my father's face made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. He opened his mouth, struggling desperately to draw enough air into his seizing lungs. Winston, William whispered, his voice cracking into a devastated, breathless rasp that cut through the silence. Winston, tell me you did not use my house as collateral to cover the margin calls. The entire dining room plunged into a suffocating, dead silence. Winston refused to look up. He stared at the shattered pieces of a crystal glass on the floor, his silence answering the question louder than any words ever could. He had leveraged their primary estate. He had gambled their home, and he had lost everything. William's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He spun toward me, his panic instantly morphing into a desperate gaslighting rage. "Natalie, you have to transfer the property back to the family immediately," he demanded, slamming his fist on the table. "You have to reverse the sale. You have the capital. You can clear this up and save our home. We are your family. You owe us this. You owe." I stared at my father, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, hard resolve. "I owe you nothing. Nothing at all. Remember when I was 24 years old? Remember when I was hospitalized with a ruptured appendix?" William blinked, clearly thrown off by the sudden shift in conversation. "What does that have to do with this?" "It has everything to do with this," I said, my voice rising with intentional, measured intensity. "I was lying in a hospital bed, terrified and drowning in medical debt. I begged you for a loan to cover my surgical bills, just a loan, and you stood beside my hospital bed, looked down at me, and told me you simply could not afford to help. You told me money was too tight. The very next morning, I watched on social media as you surprised Brittany with a brand new Porsche for her birthday. You bought her a luxury sports car while I was setting up payment plans to avoid medical bankruptcy. My charity ran out that day. It ran out completely and permanently. I am not saving your house. I am not saving Winston. You made your bed and now you get to sleep in it." A primal, furious scream ripped through the air. Brittany's face was contorted with absolute rage. Without a second of hesitation, she grabbed her heavy crystal wine glass from the table. She pulled her arm back and hurled it directly at my head with all her strength. I ducked just in time. The heavy crystal smashed against the wall right behind me, exploding into 1,000 sharp shards that rained down over my chair and the hardwood floor. Red wine splattered across the expensive wallpaper like a crime scene. Brittany lunged forward, trying to climb over the table to get to me, screaming that she was going to destroy me. Winston and William had to physically grab her arms to hold her back, wrestling her away from the center of the table as she kicked and thrashed wildly. I did not scream. I did not flinch. I slowly stood up from my chair, brushing a few tiny shards of glass off my tailored jacket. I reached into my purse, pulled out my smartphone, and calmly dialed 911. "What are you doing?" Catherine shrieked, her eyes darting frantically from the shattered glass to my phone. "Put that down right now." I held the phone to my ear, locking eyes with my mother. "I am calling the police to report a violent assault," I stated clearly. "And since Winston is currently standing in this room, I am absolutely sure the federal authorities will be thrilled to know exactly where they can find him. Yes, I need officers at the estate immediately. An assault just occurred." I lowered my phone and looked at the shattered remains of my mother's prized crystal wine glass scattered across the Persian rug. The deep red wine dripped down the custom silk wallpaper like an open wound. Brittany stood across the table, her chest heaving, her hands empty, staring at the destruction she had just caused. Catherine snapped out of her shock. She rushed over to Brittany, pulling her golden child into a protective embrace, as if I were the one hurling glassware. "How dare you call the police on your own sister?" Catherine hissed, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. "You provoked her. You came into my house on Thanksgiving to terrorize my family. Hang up that phone right now before you ruin our reputation." William stood up, his massive frame blocking the doorway. "You are not bringing cops into my dining room, Natalie. You are going to call them back and tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you dropped a glass. We handle family matters internally." I did not move. I did not blink. I just looked at the three of them. I reminded them that throwing a heavy crystal goblet at someone's head is not a family matter. It is a felony. The distant wail of sirens began to cut through the crisp autumn night, growing louder by the second. William's face went completely pale. He rushed to the front foyer as the heavy oak doors echoed with loud, authoritative knocking. Two local police officers stepped into the grand foyer, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Before they could even ask what the emergency was, my mother launched into an absolute masterclass of manipulation. Catherine collapsed against the banister, pressing the back of her hand to her forehead. "Officers, thank goodness you are here," she cried, forcing a single perfect tear to roll down her powdered cheek. "My youngest daughter, Natalie, she has been struggling with her mental health for years. We invited her to Thanksgiving dinner to offer her a safe space, and she just had a complete psychological break." Brittany immediately picked up the cue. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering as if she were terrified. She started screaming about money. Brittany whimpered, pointing a trembling finger at me. She threw a glass at the wall and threatened to ruin my husband. "We are so scared of what she might do next. Please, you have to remove her from the property before she hurts someone." William nodded grimly, adopting the tone of a weary, heartbroken patriarch. "It is true, officers. She is delusional. She keeps ranting about owning our house and freezing our bank accounts. She needs psychiatric help, not a police report." The older officer turned to me, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, we are going to need you to step outside with us right now." I did not raise my hands. I did not raise my voice. I simply tapped the small, sleek lapel pin attached to the collar of my tailored blazer. "I work in high-stakes commercial real estate," I explained calmly, looking directly at the officer. "I regularly deal with hostile sellers, defaulted tenants, and individuals who lie under pressure. For my own legal protection, my corporate security team requires me to wear a continuous recording device during volatile negotiations. This device uploads audio and high-definition video directly to my firm's secure cloud server in real time." The color instantly drained from Catherine's face. Brittany took a sharp, gasping step backward. I pulled out my phone, opened my security application, and turned the screen toward the police officers. I pressed play. The officers watched the crisp, clear footage. They heard Winston confessing to leveraging my parents' estate to cover his massive trading losses. They heard William demanding I hand over my legally purchased property to save him. They heard me refuse, bringing up the time they chose buying Brittany a Porsche over paying my emergency medical bills. And finally, they watched in high definition as Brittany grabbed the heavy crystal glass and hurled it violently at my head, shattering it against the wall. The older officer handed the phone back to me, his jaw set. He turned to Brittany, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Brittany Wilson, you are under arrest for aggravated assault. Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Brittany screamed, diving behind her husband. "Winston, do something. Call your lawyers. Tell them who we are." But Winston did not move. He could not move. Because right behind the local police, two men in sharp, dark suits had just stepped through the open front doors. They did not wear police uniforms. They wore federal badges clipped to their belts. The lead agent bypassed Brittany entirely. He walked straight past Catherine's horrified face, straight past William's frozen form, and locked eyes directly on my brother-in-law. Winston Blackwell, the federal agent, said, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "We are with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, acting in coordination with the Internal Revenue Service. You are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and the illegal leveraging of stolen assets across state lines." Winston's knees buckled. If the federal agents had not grabbed his arms, he would have collapsed onto the marble floor. They slammed him against the mahogany dining table right next to the remaining untouched turkey and locked heavy steel cuffs around his wrists. He did not fight back. He did not say a word. He just stared at the floor, breathing in rapid, shallow gasps as the agents read him his rights. William staggered backward, grabbing the back of a chair to keep from falling. His perfect, wealthy son-in-law, the man he trusted with the entire family legacy, was being hauled away by the federal government like a common street criminal. Catherine let out a piercing shriek, clutching her pearls as the agents dragged Winston toward the front door. Brittany completely lost her mind. She watched her husband being taken away, and her reaction was not one of a loving wife. It was the reaction of a spoiled child losing her favorite toy. "I do not care," she screamed, her voice echoing wildly through the foyer. "Take him. I do not need him anyway. He is a loser who gambled his own money. I do not need his pathetic Wall Street salary to survive. I am a Preston. I have my own money. I still have my $500,000 trust fund from Granddad. I will hire my own lawyers and I will ruin you, Natalie. I will crush you with my own wealth. I stood perfectly still amid the flashing red and blue lights reflecting through the large front windows. I calmly unclasped my leather briefcase. I reached inside and pulled out a single heavily redacted banking document. I looked at my sister, whose face was stained with tears and running mascara. "Actually, Brittany," I said, keeping my tone deadly quiet and perfectly even, "about that trust fund." I dropped the single piece of paper onto the center of the mahogany table. It landed right next to the pool of spilled red wine, the crisp white edges stark against the chaos of the ruined Thanksgiving dinner. The red and blue police lights continued to pulse through the front windows, casting erratic shadows across my sister and her crying face. She stared at the paper as if it were a live grenade. "Pick it up," I instructed, my voice unwavering and sharp. "Go ahead, Brittany. Read the account balance to the room. Read the exact number left in that $500,000 trust fund you just threatened to crush me with." Brittany did not move. Her manicured hands trembled violently at her sides. Her chest heaved with panicked, ragged breaths. William stepped forward, his face still pale from watching his son-in-law get hauled away in federal handcuffs. He snatched the paper from the table, his eyes darting frantically across the black and white text. He read the numbers once. He blinked hard, adjusted his posture, and read them a second time. His jaw dropped open. "Zero." William breathed out the word barely a whisper. "The absolute balance is zero. This statement is dated 3 years ago." I kept my gaze locked entirely on my sister, watching the arrogant facade completely melt away into raw, unfiltered terror. "She drained the entire account 36 months ago," I announced, ensuring my voice carried to every corner of the grand dining room. "Every single penny Granddad left her is gone." Catherine lunged forward, grabbing the paper from her husband and his hands. She scanned the document, her eyes wide with shock. "This is a mistake," she stammered, shaking her head in frantic denial. "Brittany is a successful social media influencer. She has brand deals. She travels the world. She has millions of followers." I let out a harsh, biting laugh. "She bought them, Mother. She bought the followers. She bought the engagement. She bought the entire illusion of success." Brittany let out a loud, strangled sob, burying her face in her hands. I took a step closer to the table, dominating the physical space in the room. I laid out the brutal, undeniable truth. Did you really think companies were paying her to stay in five-star resorts? She was liquidating her trust fund to pay for fake luxury. She rented grounded private jets by the hour just to take photos inside the cabins. She purchased designer shopping bags on the internet just to pretend she had gone on shopping sprees in Paris and Milan. She blew $500,000 trying to convince strangers on the internet that she was wealthy, while her husband was quietly mortgaging your house to cover his gambling debts on Wall Street. You are a pair of absolute frauds living in a house of cards, and the wind just blew it all down. The absolute silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and incredibly satisfying. The golden child, the perfect daughter, was finally exposed as nothing more than a hollow, desperate shell. Catherine and her face shifted from shock to a deep, ugly shade of red. She could not accept that her perfect daughter was a failure. She needed a scapegoat. She needed me to be the villain. She turned her furious glare toward me, pointing an accusing finger. "You knew about this!" Catherine shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You are her sister. You work in finance. You deal with contracts and money every single day. Why did you not guide her? Why did you let her destroy her financial security? It was your responsibility to step in and stop this from happening." The sheer audacity of her accusation sent a surge of hot, righteous adrenaline straight through my veins. I did not back down. I stepped right into her personal space, forcing her to look me in the eye. I fired back my words, striking like physical blows. 4 years ago, I saw her draining the principal balance. I sat you down in the living room and showed you the alarming withdrawal patterns. I brought you spreadsheets. I brought you projections. And what did you do? Mother. Catherine swallowed hard, taking a slight step back. "I will remind you," I continued, my voice relentless. "You snatched the folder out of my hands and threw it into the fireplace. You told me that a lowly property flipper had absolutely no right to give unsolicited financial advice to a rising socialite. You explicitly forbade me from ever questioning the expenses again. You chose her illusion over my reality. You enabled this destruction. Do not you dare try to pin your spectacular parenting failures on me." Catherine had absolutely nothing to say. She looked at William for support, but he was staring vacantly at the ruined turkey, looking like a man who had just watched his entire legacy evaporate into thin air. Brittany continued to sob hysterically, mourning the loss of her fake internet empire and the terrifying reality of her impending poverty. The satisfaction of the moment was absolute. The toxic family dynamic that had suffocated me for my entire life was finally broken, shattered into a million irreparable pieces by the heavy hammer of truth. I had won. I turned to walk away, fully intending to leave that house. Suddenly, a sharp buzz interrupted the sound of Brittany and her crying. The noise came from the center of the dining table. The smartphone, which Winston had dropped during his panic earlier, was vibrating violently against the polished wood. It vibrated once, then twice, then a third time. I stopped in my tracks. I walked back to the table and looked at the screen. A new text message notification was prominently displayed. The sender was an unsaved number with a Chicago area code. The text message was short, brutal, and clear. "Time is up. We are coming for the 2 million. The crisp chill of Black Friday morning bit through the air as I stepped out of my black SUV and walked up the cobblestone driveway of my parents' estate. The massive brick colonial looked exactly the same as it had during the Thanksgiving disaster hours earlier, but the atmosphere radiating from the property felt entirely different. The illusion of the untouchable legacy was completely shattered. I had not come back to gloat. I returned for one specific reason. I was there to collect Grandma Rose's antique grandfather clock, the only piece of my childhood that held genuine sentimental value, which I legally acquired in the estate sale. I was not alone. Flanking me were Marcus and Vance, two ex-military contractors from my firm's executive protection detail. After the physical altercation with Brittany and the federal raid, my security director had explicitly mandated armed escorts for all personal movements. I pushed open the front doors without knocking. The foyer was eerily quiet, stripped of performative cheer. William and Catherine were standing near the grand staircase, looking like hollowed-out ghosts. William was frantically scrolling through a tablet, likely watching the family stock portfolio plummet following Winston's federal indictment. Catherine was clutching a cold cup of coffee, her designer silk robe wrinkled. They froze when they saw me walk in with my security team. Before Catherine could even open her mouth to hurl venomous insults, a violent, deafening pounding echoed from the front doors behind me. Marcus smoothly stepped aside, placing a hand near his weapon as the heavy doors burst violently open. Two massive, broad-shouldered men stepped into the foyer. They did not look like federal agents, and they certainly did not look like local law enforcement. They wore cheap suits that stretched tightly across heavily muscled chests. The lead man had a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow and knuckles wrapped in faded scar tissue. They radiated a terrifying predatory energy that instantly sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the room. The lead man locked his cold eyes on my father. He took 2 heavy steps forward, his boots echoing on the imported marble floor. "Winston is currently unavailable to answer his phone," the scarred man rasped, his voice sounding like grinding gravel. So we came directly to the source. "The boss in Chicago is completely out of patience, William. The margin call window closed at midnight. We are here for the $2 million, and we are not leaving this property empty-handed." William physically recoiled, his back hitting the wooden banister. The color completely vanished from his face, leaving him looking sickly. 2 million. William stammered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. I do not have $2 million in liquid cash. The federal authorities froze our primary accounts last night when they took Winston into custody. We have absolutely nothing to give you right now. The second man, who was even larger than the first, cracked his knuckles with a sickening pop. That sounds like a personal problem, William. We do not care about federal freezes or family drama. You either sign over the deed to this estate right now, or we start breaking things until the value adds up. Absolute blind panic overtook my father. He looked wildly around the room, desperately searching for a lifeline, any possible way to deflect the violent threat standing in his foyer. His terrified gaze landed on me. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest, throwing his own daughter to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. She has it! William shouted, his voice cracking into a cowardly shriek. My daughter Natalie has the money. She is a commercial real estate developer. She just finalized a multi-million-dollar purchase on my mother's estate. The funds are fully cleared. Take her property. She holds the family wealth now. She will sign the deed over to you to cover Winston's debt. Just leave my house alone. The two loan sharks slowly turned their heavy gazes toward me. They took a menacing step in my direction, clearly expecting me to cower the exact same way my father had. They expected an easy target. I did not even blink. I stood perfectly straight, my posture radiating unwavering authority. I raised my hand in a sharp gesture. Instantly, Marcus and Vance stepped smoothly in front of me, their stances widening, their hands resting firmly on their tactical belts. The shift in the physical power dynamic was immediate and absolute. The two loan sharks stopped dead in their tracks, suddenly realizing they had walked into a room with professional, lethal opposition. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out my corporate identification badge, alongside a folded legal injunction. I stepped slightly around Marcus, holding the documents up for the scarred man to read. I am Natalie Preston, I stated, my voice ringing with icy precision. And my cowardly father is lying to you. The fraudulent lien Winston placed on my grandmother's property was legally voided by the federal seizure last night. That deed is currently locked in an irrevocable corporate trust under my holding company, protected by federal jurisdiction. You cannot touch a single square inch of my property, and if you take one more step toward me, my security team will legally neutralize you as a viable threat. The lead collector glared at my documents, recognizing the unassailable legal reality of the situation. He scowled, his jaw clenching as he realized I was completely untouchable. Slowly, he turned his predatory gaze back to William, who let out a pathetic whimper of terror. I smoothly unclasped my leather briefcase. I reached inside and pulled out a crisp manila folder. I walked straight forward and handed it directly to the massive, scarred debt collector. William's house is mortgaged to the hilt, I announced. But Catherine has a hidden offshore account in the Caymans. Here are the exact routing numbers. The scarred man snatched the manila folder from my outstretched hand, his rough fingers tracing the printed routing numbers. The heavy silence in the grand foyer was instantly shattered by a guttural, terrifying shriek. Catherine lunged forward, her perfectly manicured hands clawing desperately at the air, trying to rip the documents away from the debt collector. Marcus did not even draw his weapon. He simply stepped into her path, crossing his massive arms and letting her crash into his solid frame like a bird hitting a glass window. She stumbled backward, gasping for breath, her designer silk robe slipping off one shoulder. Are you completely insane? Catherine screamed, her voice cracking as she pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. You have no right to touch my private financial records. You have absolutely no right to give my personal property to these violent street thugs. William stared at his wife, his jaw completely unhinged. His eyes darted from the manila folder in the loan shark's hands to Catherine's flushed, panicked face. What Cayman account? William demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerously low, trembling register. Catherine, what offshore account is she talking about right now? Catherine refused to look at him. She stared at the marble floor, her chest heaving, her hands gripping the edges of her silk robe as if trying to hold her entire fabricated reality together. Tell him, Mother, I commanded, my voice cutting through the tension like a newly sharpened blade. Tell your husband exactly how you managed to maintain your lavish country club lifestyle, your private charity galas, and your weekly shopping sprees in Paris when his construction business took that massive financial hit 3 years ago. Tell him where the reserve funds actually went. William grabbed Catherine by the shoulders, forcing her to look at him. Did you steal from the company? He roared, shaking her slightly. Did you siphon money from the operating accounts while I was laying off my own hardworking employees just to keep us afloat? Catherine slapped his hands away, her perfectly powdered face contorting into a mask of pure vicious entitlement. I took what I was owed, she spat, her voice echoing violently off the high ceilings. I gave you the absolute best years of my life, William. I built your prestigious social standing from the ground up. I hosted your miserable, boring clients. I made you acceptable to polite society. You expected me to just cancel my exclusive memberships and stop wearing couture because you made a few terrible business investments. I totally refused to be humiliated in front of my wealthy peers. I took a small percentage of the vendor payments, a tiny percentage. You never even noticed it was gone until this exact second. You skimmed millions from our own business. William whispered, his eyes wide with a horrifying, crushing realization. You bled us completely dry from the inside out while telling me to work harder. The scarred loan shark let out a rough, grating laugh. He tapped the thick folder against his massive palm. I do not care about your pathetic marital issues, William. I just care that these specific routing numbers are active. $2 million covers the debt. We will drain this account by noon, and we will consider Winston's leverage fully resolved. How did you even find this? Catherine hissed at me, her eyes burning with pure, unadulterated hatred. I paid the absolute best offshore accountants in the world to bury that money behind 7 layers of untraceable shell companies. You are just a lowly property flipper. You know absolutely nothing about complex international finance. I smiled, feeling a deep, profoundly satisfying warmth spread through my chest. I am not a simple property flipper, Mother. I run an elite commercial real estate acquisitions firm. When you tried to buy that massive commercial plaza in downtown Boston last year to launder Winston's illegal trading money, my firm successfully represented the seller. Your financial shell game is incredibly sloppy, Mother. I saw the massive wire transfers bouncing through dummy corporations in the Bahamas. I diligently tracked the hidden routing numbers straight back to your private Cayman accounts. I watched you try to wash stolen money through prime real estate. You thought you were outsmarting the entire system, but you left a digital paper trail a mile wide. Catherine glared at me, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Fine, she snapped, lifting her chin in a desperate, pathetic attempt to salvage her shattered dignity. Let them take the $2 million. There is over $4 million in that secure account. I will still have more than enough capital to maintain my luxurious lifestyle, and I will make absolutely sure you are permanently ruined in this city, Natalie. I will personally see to it that your name is blacklisted from every major real estate firm on the entire East Coast. I slowly shook my head, savoring the absolute destruction of her unearned arrogance. I reached into my leather briefcase one more time. I pulled out a single neatly printed sheet of financial paper and stepped smoothly past Marcus. I held the paper out, letting it hover right in front of Catherine's face. I told you, Mother, your shell game was sloppy, I said, keeping my tone deadly calm and perfectly even. You blindly trusted Winston to set up those offshore accounts for you. You handed him full administrative access to handle the international wire transfers so William would not see the transactions on the domestic ledgers. Catherine snatched the paper from my hand. Her eyes darted frantically across the printed lines. Her breathing suddenly stopped entirely. I casually flipped to the last page of the thick offshore dossier in my own hands, showing the final transaction history to the loan sharks. But the ultimate joke is completely on you, Mom. The account is totally and completely empty. Winston forged your signature last month and secretly transferred every single penny to a younger woman named Chloe. Brittany let out a guttural gasp. She stared at the transaction history, her perfectly contoured face contorting into agony. Winston had not just completely bankrupted her. He had stolen her mother's secret offshore fortune and funneled every dime to his mistress. Her once perfect golden marriage was now officially nothing more than a miserable corpse. The scarred loan shark scoffed, tossing the folder onto the marble floor. "Your family is a joke," he growled. "Winston has 48 hours to pay or we bypass properties and start breaking bones. Find him. Find the girl. I do not care. You are on notice." The two men turned and marched out the front doors, the heavy oak slamming shut behind them. The reality of the betrayal crashed down on Brittany like a collapsing building. She dropped to her knees in the entryway, uncaring that her designer silk trousers were pooling in the spilled water. She grabbed fistfuls of her golden hair, screaming Winston's name into the empty air. "He promised me." Brittany wailed, tears carving tracks through her expensive foundation. "He told me I was the only reason he worked so hard. He told me Chloe was just an analyst. He bought her a condo in Miami with my trust fund. He bought her diamonds with your money, Mom. He left me with absolutely nothing." She collapsed onto her side, weeping, waiting for her mother to offer the comforting embrace she had received her entire life. Catherine did not move toward her daughter. She stood perfectly upright, smoothing her wrinkled silk robe, her mind clearly racing through legal loopholes and damage control strategies. Her eyes were cold, calculating, and completely devoid of maternal warmth. "Stop that crying right this instant, Brittany!" Catherine barked, her voice snapping. "Get up off that floor. You are ruining your clothes and looking ridiculous. We do not have time for a hysterical breakdown." Brittany choked on a sob, looking up with devastated eyes. "Mom, he cheated on me. He stole millions. He is going to federal prison." "I do not care who he slept with," Catherine snapped. "You are simply going to stand up, fix your makeup, and call our legal team. You are not filing for divorce. You will stay legally married to that miserable fraud for as long as this federal investigation lasts. If you divorce him now, the prosecutors can compel you to testify against him under oath. They will tear through your finances and expose my offshore accounts to the Internal Revenue Service. You will invoke spousal privilege. You will play the supportive, heartbroken wife. You will not say a word to the feds, and you will protect this family's reputation at all costs." I stood in the center of the foyer and let out a slow, echoing clap. "Incredible," I said, my voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Truly a masterclass in maternal devotion. Your daughter just discovered her entire life is a fraudulent lie, and your only instinct is to weaponize her marriage to dodge a tax evasion subpoena." Catherine glared at me, her jaw clenched tight. "You know nothing about loyalty, Natalie. We protect the family name first. Appearances are everything. Without our perfect family reputation, we are absolutely nothing." I laughed, a harsh, humorless sound slicing through the tension. "Oh, I know all about your fanatical dedication to appearances, Mother. I remember the winter charity gala you hosted right in this very house when I was 17. I spent 3 months designing and sewing my own formal gown because you refused to buy me one. I was so proud of it. But when the guests started arriving, you took one look at my handmade dress and dragged me by my arm into the caterer's kitchen. You told me I looked like cheap trash. You told me a homemade dress would make the prestigious Watson family look like poverty-stricken charity cases. You locked me in that sweltering kitchen for 6 hours, forcing me to wash dishes with the catering staff, while you paraded Brittany around the ballroom in her $5,000 Valentino gown. You chose a piece of fabric over your own daughter. You have always valued the shiny fake exterior over the rotting reality inside." William suddenly slumped against the wall, clutching his chest. "We are ruined," he muttered, his eyes glazed over. "The business is gone. The house is mortgaged. Winston took everything. We have no leverage left." He was right. They had absolutely nothing left to hide behind. The illusion was dead. Before William could spiral further into his panic attack, a sharp, upbeat marimba ringtone shattered the silence. The sound did not come from my parents. It came from the pocket of my tailored blazer. I slowly pulled out my phone. The screen displayed an incoming call from an unknown out-of-state number. Normally, I would send it straight to voicemail, but the timing was too perfect, the atmosphere too highly charged. I pressed the green button, switched the audio to speakerphone, and held the device up for the entire room to hear. Hello, I answered, my voice steady and commanding. Is this Natalie Preston? A woman asked. Her voice was young, sharp, and laced with a frantic, nervous energy. Speaking, I replied. The line crackled slightly with static. You do not know me, but my name is Chloe, the voice announced, instantly draining the remaining color from Brittany's tear-stained face. I know everything that happened tonight. I know the feds took Winston, and I know you are actively taking down the rest of the family. I am currently packing a bag to leave the country, but before I go, we need to do some business. I have Winston's private black book. It contains every password, every hidden account, every single dirty transaction he executed for your father and your mother over the last 5 years. I will sell it to you right now for exactly $50,000. I told Chloe to meet me at a private corner booth inside a high-end espresso bar in the financial district. I arrived early, flanked by Marcus. Chloe walked in. She wore designer sunglasses and carried a discreet leather tote. She slid into the booth and placed a worn black notebook on the marble table. $50,000, Chloe said, keeping her voice barely above a whisper. I have a flight to Zurich in 3 hours and I need the liquid capital to clear customs comfortably. I did not waste time with negotiations. $50,000 was pocket change for my firm. It was a microscopic price to pay for the destruction of the toxic empire my parents had built. I pulled out my phone, opened my banking application, and executed a wire transfer to the offshore account she provided. Check your balance, I instructed coldly. Chloe glanced at her phone screen. A satisfied smile broke across her face. She pulled her hand back, sliding the black book toward me. It is all yours, she said, leaning in closer. Winston thought he was a genius. He convinced your father to use the family construction company to wash the money. But it was never just a bad investment strategy. It was a massive Ponzi scheme. Winston took capital from new domestic investors to pay off the massive losses he racked up with foreign clients. When foreign clients demanded returns, he drained your mother's secret accounts to cover his tracks. I opened the leather cover. The pages were filled with meticulous handwritten columns, account numbers, and routing codes. Winston kept physical records, I asked, shocked by the absolute stupidity of the man my sister married. He did not trust digital clouds. Chloe laughed, standing up from the booth. He thought a physical ledger was safer. He was an idiot. Enjoy the reading material, Natalie. It is going to absolutely destroy your family. I took the book to the secure conference room of my corporate headquarters. I summoned my 2 lead forensic accountants, David and Sarah. They were experts at untangling complex corporate fraud. I dropped the ledger onto the glass table and told them to start tearing it apart. We spent 4 hours dissecting every handwritten digit, cross-referencing Winston's sloppy records with the public filings of my father's construction firm. The deeper we dug, the darker the reality became. Winston had been running a Ponzi scheme, funneling stolen investor dollars through the legitimate payroll and vendor accounts of William's business. He used the company's reputation as a clean front. But then Sarah paused, her finger resting on a highlighted column near the back of the ledger. Natalie, Sarah said, her voice tight with disbelief. Look at this specific disbursement line. It repeats every single month for the last 3 years. Winston was transferring money out of the fraudulent pool, but it was not going to his trading accounts. It was going into a domestic holding company. I pulled the ledger closer, scanning the corresponding routing numbers. I recognized the holding company instantly. It was the Shell Corporation my father used to purchase his luxury vehicles and fund his golf memberships. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. William was not a victim here. I stated, the cold truth settling heavily in my chest. He was not just a naive father-in-law who got tricked by a smooth-talking fraud. He knew exactly what Winston was doing. David ran the calculations on his tablet. It is a systematic extraction, he confirmed. Your father was taking a flat 10% cut of every single fraudulent dollar that passed through his business accounts. He was charging Winston a laundering fee. He knowingly facilitated a federal crime to fund his own lifestyle, while simultaneously complaining about the company's financial struggles to justify laying off his workers. The sheer level of hypocrisy was absolutely staggering. For years, William had lectured me about hard work, fiscal responsibility, and the sacred honor of the family name. He had treated me like a financial disappointment, when in reality, he was a criminal profiting off his son-in-law's illegal scheme. He was no better than the loan sharks who had threatened him in his foyer. He was merely wearing a more expensive suit. I thanked my accountants and instructed them to digitize and securely encrypt every single page of the ledger. I needed the original copy for my next move. I picked up my phone and opened the family group chat, a thread I had not initiated a conversation in for nearly 5 years. "I am calling a mandatory family emergency meeting," I typed. "You have exactly 1 hour to prepare. Do not attempt to drive yourselves. I am sending private black cars to collect you. If you refuse to get in, I will hand this information over to the federal prosecutors holding Winston." I locked my phone and walked down the hallway toward my private executive boardroom. The space was sleek, modern, and intimidating, surrounded by glass walls offering a commanding view of the city skyline. This was my domain. This was the fortress I had built with blood, sweat, and determination. 45 minutes later, the heavy glass doors slid open. My private security team escorted William, Catherine, and Brittany into the room. They looked completely shattered. Brittany's eyes were swollen and red. Catherine looked pale and disoriented without her haughty arrogance. William walked with a heavy slump, his eyes darting nervously around the pristine boardroom. They had spent my life looking down on my career, and now they were standing in the epicenter of my success. I did not offer them a seat. I stood at the head of the long mahogany conference table, radiating absolute authority. I looked at the 3 people who had spent decades trying to make me feel small, worthless, and inadequate. I slowly raised my hand. I dropped the black book onto the mahogany conference table. The thud of the black leather notebook hitting the mahogany echoed like a gunshot through the boardroom. William stared at the cover, his breath hitching. Recognition dawned on his face with horrifying speed. The arrogant veneer of the patriarch melted away, leaving the panicked expression of a cornered animal. He knew every handwritten column, every routing number, and every damning detail of his own criminal complicity. With a guttural yell, William lunged across the wide conference table. His fingers clawed desperately at the polished wood, trying to snatch the ledger before I could open it. He did not even make it halfway. Marcus and another security guard moved with terrifying precision. They grabbed William by the shoulders of his Italian suit and forcefully slammed him back into his leather chair. William struggled, kicking his legs and thrashing his arms, but the 2 men pinned him down effortlessly. His face turned crimson as he gasped for air. "Sit down and stay down," Marcus commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that instantly paralyzed the rest of the room. Catherine shrieked, clutching her handbag against her chest. "You cannot treat him like this," she shrilled, her voice cracking. "He is your father, Natalie. Order your thugs to release him immediately." I ignored her completely. I kept my gaze locked onto William, watching the terror radiate from his bloodshot eyes. I reached out and flipped the black cover open, turning directly to the bookmarked page near the center of the ledger. Winston was a terrible criminal. "Dad," I said, keeping my tone deadly calm. "He wrote everything down. He meticulously documented every stolen dollar he washed through your construction firm. He recorded the dates, amounts, and specific offshore routing numbers. But the most interesting part is the recurring transaction column highlighted on page 42. William stopped struggling. He slumped against the grip of the security guards, his breathing ragged. He refused to look at the open book. "It turns out you were not just a clueless father-in-law being manipulated by a greedy son-in-law," I continued. "You knew Winston was running a massive Ponzi scheme. You knew he was draining the accounts of innocent investors. And instead of stopping him, you actively facilitated the fraud. You charged him a flat 10% laundering fee for using your corporate accounts. You took a cut of stolen money to pay for your memberships and imported cars." Brittany gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "You knew," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You knew Winston was stealing and you let him do it. You took a cut while he destroyed my marriage and bankrupted my future." "Shut up, Brittany," William snarled, his panic morphing into vicious anger. "I did what I had to do to keep this family afloat. The construction business was bleeding capital. I needed the cash flow to maintain our lifestyle. I protected our reputation. You protected your own pathetic ego, I fired back, leaning over the table. You bled your own company dry, laid off honest employees, and funded a criminal enterprise just so you could keep playing the wealthy Boston patriarch. You have always been a thief, William. This is just the first time you committed a federal crime to do it. William scoffed, spitting a curse under his breath. You have no right to judge me, Natalie. I gave you everything. I raised you. I provided for you. You gave me nothing, I countered. You took from me. I looked down at my father, savoring the power reversal. You stole my first startup's business plan when I was 23 and gave it to Brittany, who bankrupted it in 6 months. Consider this the interest on that stolen intellectual property. I am handing this black book directly to the federal prosecutors tomorrow morning. The FBI will freeze every remaining asset you have. They will seize the house, the cars, and the bank accounts. You are going to federal prison, William, and you will not have a dime left to your name. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Catherine stared at me in muted horror. Brittany was quietly sobbing into her hands, completely shattered by the total collapse of her pristine universe. The great Watson family empire was officially dead, reduced to ashes by their own staggering greed and unparalleled arrogance. But William was not finished. The desperation in his eyes suddenly vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating sneer. He shook off the security guards who stepped back slightly at my silent nod, allowing him to sit upright. He straightened his ruined suit jacket and glared at me with pure, unadulterated malice. You think you have won, Natalie. William rasped, a cruel smile twisting his lips. You think you can just burn us to the ground and walk away back to your perfect, wealthy life? But you are forgetting a very important legal detail about the state we live in. I crossed my arms, unimpressed by his sudden shift in demeanor. You have no leverage left, William. You are entirely out of place. William let out a dark, rattling laugh that echoed in the quiet room. Have you ever heard of filial responsibility laws, Natalie? He asked, his voice dripping with poisonous satisfaction. It is a little-known statute, but let me personally assure you it is incredibly powerful. You see, since Winston drained the accounts and the feds are going to seize whatever is left, your mother and I are legally impoverished now. As of this very morning, we are officially and entirely destitute. He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table, mirroring my stance. Under state law, we can sue you, our incredibly wealthy, highly successful daughter, to force you to pay our massive debts and living expenses. You are legally obligated to financially support your indigent parents. If you destroy us, we will legally chain ourselves to your bank accounts, and we will bleed you dry until the day we die. I did not think William actually had the nerve to follow through on his absurd threat. He was a cornered rat, stripped of his dignity and his fraudulent fortune. But rats bite when they are starving. 72 hours after I kicked my family out of my corporate headquarters, the receptionist at my private penthouse buzzed my secure line. I had a visitor. I authorized the elevator access, expecting a courier. Instead, a tired-looking process server stepped into my foyer, followed immediately by my sister. Brittany pushed past the man, her chin held high, wearing a vintage Chanel coat she had clearly salvaged from the wreckage of her marriage. The process server handed me a thick manila envelope and quickly retreated to the elevator. I stared at the dense stack of legal filings. William had done it. He had officially filed a lawsuit against me under the state's archaic filial responsibility statutes, demanding I pay for their housing, their legal defense fees, and their daily living expenses. Brittany crossed her arms, a sickeningly triumphant smile stretching across her face. She stepped onto my imported Persian rug, looking around my sprawling penthouse with greedy eyes. You really thought you could just cut us off and watch us drown? She sneered, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. You underestimated Dad. The law says you have to support your destitute parents, Natalie. And since I live with them now, you are supporting me too. I am going to bleed you for every single penny. I am going to buy a new townhouse in Back Bay with your corporate dividends. I will take your cars, your clothes, and your company stock. You are going to maintain our standard of living, or the court will freeze your assets and force you to do it. You are trapped. You remember when I was 20 and Mom forced me to co-sign that fraudulent loan for your failed boutique? I asked, my tone icy. I paid it off in absolute silence so you would not go to jail. Now you want to use the law to enslave me again. The sheer audacity is staggering. I looked at the lawsuit in my hands, then looked back at my sister. Her arrogance was truly boundless, anchored entirely in a reality that no longer existed. She genuinely believed a civil court judge would order me to fund her shopping sprees and luxury vacations just because her husband was currently sitting in a federal holding cell. You are incredibly delusional, Brittany, I said, tossing the lawsuit onto my entry table. Filial laws are designed to keep elderly parents out of state-funded nursing homes. They are not designed to subsidize your couture wardrobe or pay for mom's weekly country club brunches. Brittany laughed a sharp, grating sound. It does not matter what the law was designed for. It matters what our lawyers can twist it to do. Dad found a firm willing to take the case on contingency. They are filing emergency injunctions to tap your accounts by Friday. You should have just paid Winston's debt when you had the chance. Now you are going to pay for all of us forever. Get out of my house, I commanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Before I have my security team physically throw you into the street. Brittany smirked, turning toward the elevator. Enjoy your money while you still have access to it, Natalie. I will see you in court. The moment the elevator doors closed, I grabbed the legal filings and headed straight to my office. I summoned my lead corporate litigator, a notoriously ruthless attorney named Jonathan Vance. Jonathan was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who destroyed hostile takeovers for sport. He walked into my glass-walled boardroom, took the lawsuit from my hands, and spent precisely 4 minutes reading the demands. I paced the length of the room, my blood boiling. I told him to file an immediate motion for dismissal. I wanted William countersued for frivolous litigation, harassment, and emotional distress. I wanted my family buried so deep in legal fees they would never see daylight again. Jonathan set the papers down on the mahogany table. He looked up at me and a slow, terrifying smile spread across his face. We are not going to file a motion for dismissal, Natalie, he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. We are not going to fight this lawsuit at all. I stopped pacing and stared at him. Are you out of your mind? I demanded. They want $50,000 a month in living expenses. They want me to pay for the criminal defense attorneys Winston needs for his Ponzi scheme. Jonathan shook his head, leaning back in his leather chair. You are looking at the threat, Natalie, but you are completely missing the opportunity. He tapped the front page of the lawsuit. Filial support is not automatically granted. To qualify for a single dime of your money, your father and your mother have to legally prove total impoverishment to the civil court. They have to swear under oath that they have absolutely zero hidden assets, zero offshore accounts, and zero alternative streams of income. If they lie, they commit felony perjury, Jonathan explained smoothly. If they tell the truth, they hand the federal investigators a perfectly packaged map directly to their offshore accounts and the money they helped Winston launder. They think they are putting a loaded gun to your head, but they just handed us the absolute perfect weapon to dismantle their entire fraudulent empire from the inside out. I felt my heart skip a beat as the sheer brilliance of the trap began to fully materialize in my mind. Jonathan leaned forward, his dark eyes gleaming with predatory anticipation. Which means, he whispered, we get to subpoena and open every single one of their financial books to the federal government. I smiled, finally recognizing the absolute complete destruction of their entire fraudulent legacy. Jonathan Vance moved with the lethal efficiency of an apex predator. Within 48 hours of William filing his absurd filial responsibility lawsuit, Jonathan submitted our counterdemands to the civil court. If my parents wanted to claim total impoverishment to siphon my wealth, they had to prove it under oath. The judge agreed immediately, signing a mandate for absolute and unredacted financial disclosure. We subpoenaed every bank statement, tax return, offshore wire transfer, and corporate ledger from William's construction firm over the last decade. The trap had slammed shut with bone-breaking force. William had essentially handed the federal government the legal right to strip search his entire life. The sheer terror of the court mandate hit Catherine like a physical blow. The illusion of her untouchable status evaporated the moment the discovery papers arrived at their sprawling suburban mansion. She knew the forensic accountants would not just look at bank accounts. They would audit assets, insurance riders, and personal property. That night, under the cover of darkness, Catherine abandoned her pristine elegance. Wearing a black cashmere trench coat over her silk pajamas, she dragged a heavy iron shovel out to the manicured rose garden. The moon illuminated her frantic, pathetic movements. She dropped to her knees in the damp soil, ruining her perfect French manicure as she hacked violently at the earth. She was burying a velvet-lined lockbox containing $3 million worth of undeclared Cartier watches, diamond tennis bracelets, and heirloom emeralds she had systematically siphoned from William's company funds. She sobbed as she shoved the dirt back over the box, desperately trying to hide the physical evidence of her greed before the auditors arrived. She was far too late. The very next morning, a fleet of black government vehicles pulled up to the glass front doors of Williams' construction headquarters. The Internal Revenue Service had officially joined the fray. Armed with the meticulous digital copies of Winston's Black Book that my team had conveniently passed along to the federal prosecutor, the IRS agents executed a massive coordinated raid. They seized hard drives, filed through filing cabinets, and locked down the server rooms. They froze the company payroll accounts and slapped padlocks on the warehouse doors. The audit was not just a review, it was an inquisition. The agents quickly matched the 10% laundering fees in Winston's ledger directly to William's private holding company. The fraud was undeniable, documented, and completely exposed. William and Catherine were summoned to a mandatory mediation session the following week. They walked into the sterile, neutral conference room at the downtown courthouse, looking like ghosts. William had aged 10 years. His skin was gray, his hands trembled constantly, and his expensive suit hung loosely on his shrinking frame. Catherine sat rigidly in her chair, her eyes darting nervously around the room, clutching a cheap canvas tote bag instead of her usual Hermes Birkin. Brittany was conspicuously absent, having already fled to a discount motel to hide from the paparazzi swarming their estate. "You have destroyed us," William rasped, staring across the table at me with hollow, defeated eyes. "The IRS is seizing the corporate assets. The state is prosecuting me for tax evasion. I am facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Are you happy now, Natalie? Is this what you wanted?" I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands neatly on the table. "You destroyed yourself, William. I simply provided the lighting so everyone could finally see the rot. You filed a lawsuit to steal my money because you thought I would settle to avoid a public scandal. You forgot that I do not care about your fabricated social standing." Catherine slammed her hand on the table, a sudden desperate flare of her old arrogance surfacing. "We still have the house," she spat, her voice trembling with barely contained hysteria. "The federal government cannot seize our primary residence without a lengthy legal battle. We are protected under the homestead exemptions. We will sell the estate, pay off the immediate IRS penalties, and relocate. We will survive this, and we will never speak to you again." I smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp smile that made Catherine instantly recoil. "You really should pay closer attention to your male mother," I said smoothly. "Or perhaps you should have paid closer attention to your husband's increasingly desperate financial maneuvers over the last 8 months. William let out a sudden, choking gasp. He grabbed his chest, his eyes widening in pure terror as he realized exactly what I was about to say. I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out a single, heavily embossed legal folder. I slid it across the polished wood table until it rested directly in front of Catherine. "When Winston's offshore margins started collapsing last year, William panicked," I explained, watching the blood drain from Catherine's face. "He needed liquid capital to cover the fraudulent returns for his new investors. So he leveraged the only clean asset you had left. He took out a massive high-interest secondary mortgage on your beloved suburban mansion. And when the Ponzi scheme finally dried up 3 months ago, William stopped making those mortgage payments. He defaulted. The bank categorized the loan as a highly toxic asset and immediately prepared to auction it off to debt collectors." Catherine turned slowly to look at William. Her voice was a horrified, breathless whisper. "You mortgaged the house, you put our home up as collateral for Winston's illegal trades." William could not even look at her. He buried his face in his trembling hands, letting out a pathetic, broken sob. I tapped the legal folder resting in front of Catherine. "That is where my elite commercial real estate acquisitions firm stepped in," I said, driving the final nail into the coffin of their empire. "My firm specializes in purchasing distressed high-value debt. We bought your toxic mortgage directly from the bank last week for pennies on the dollar. You do not owe the bank anymore, Mother. You owe me. I am your direct lender, and I do not offer extensions." Catherine stared at me, her mouth opening and closing silently, completely paralyzed by the absolute totality of her defeat. I stood up, buttoned my blazer, and walked out of the mediation room without looking back. 2 hours later, Catherine and William sat in the dark living room of their echoing, empty mansion. The power had already been shut off. A sharp, aggressive knock hammered against their heavy oak front door. William slowly opened it. A grim-faced process server stood on the porch holding a clipboard. He shoved a thick stack of papers into William's shaking hands. "You have been officially served," the man announced flatly. "You have a 30-day notice of absolute foreclosure and immediate eviction. Vacate the premises." William stood frozen on the porch. The heavy oak door remained ajar as cold night air rushed into the foyer. He stared at the 30-day eviction notice clutched in his trembling fingers. Catherine hovered behind him, the color drained from her face. Before either of them spoke, the screech of tires echoed up the driveway. A battered yellow taxi abruptly stopped near the portico. The back doors flew open. Brittany stumbled out, looking absolutely unhinged. She wore mismatched designer sweatpants and a stained silk blouse. Her mascara was smeared down her cheeks. She aggressively yanked the trunk open and began hurling oversized black trash bags onto the pristine cobblestones. The bags split open upon impact, spilling an avalanche of Prada, Gucci, and Hermes purses across the driveway. "Help me carry these inside," Brittany shrieked, kicking a vintage Chanel tote toward the front steps. The federal agents locked the gates to my estate. They froze every single account. Winston's assets are completely gone. My credit cards are declining at gas stations. I had to bribe a security guard just to let me stuff my closet inventory into these garbage bags. I am moving back into my old bedroom. William slowly turned around, his face completely hollow. He held up the legal document. "We do not have a home anymore, Brittany." Catherine whimpered, her voice cracking into a pathetic sob. "Natalie bought our defaulted mortgage. She owns it. We are being evicted." Brittany dropped a heavily studded handbag. Her jaw dropped. "Natalie is taking the house. That is impossible. She cannot do that to her own flesh and blood. She already did." William snarled, his brief moment of shock rapidly converting into toxic, desperate rage. He crumpled the eviction notice in his fist. "She thinks she can just rip our entire legacy out from under us and throw us into the street. She thinks she holds all the cards. We are not going to let her get away with this," Brittany screamed, stomping her foot on the cobblestones. "She is my sister. We share the same blood. You are her parents. She owes us a roof over our heads. We are going down there right now. I will drag her out of her penthouse by her hair if I have to." William threw the paper onto the floor. "Get back in the taxi," he ordered. He grabbed Catherine by the arm, dragging her out the door without bothering to lock it. The three of them crammed into the back of the waiting cab, the stench of stale cigarette smoke a harsh contrast to the leather seats of the vehicles they had lost. William barked the address of my downtown high-rise at the driver. The ride was filled with venomous rants. They convinced themselves that if they screamed loudly enough, they could bully me into submission. 30 minutes later, the taxi pulled up to the gleaming glass and steel facade of the prestigious downtown tower. The building was an architectural marvel, a beacon of modern wealth situated in the most expensive commercial district in the city. William threw his last remaining $50 bill at the driver, and the three of them stormed through the revolving glass doors like an invading army. The lobby was an expansive cathedral of white marble, brushed bronze, and cascading water features. A massive mahogany reception desk dominated the center, manned by two sharply dressed concierges and flanked by imposing private security personnel. Brittany marched straight up to the desk, slamming her hands down on the polished wood. "Call the penthouse immediately," she demanded, her voice shrill and echoing loudly across the quiet, sophisticated lobby. Tell Natalie her family is here. We are going up. The concierge, a composed man with an earpiece, looked at her chaotic appearance with polite disdain. I am sorry, ma'am. The penthouse level is completely restricted. You must be on the approved visitor registry to access the private elevators. I am her sister, Brittany shrieked, her face turning an ugly shade of red. This is her father and her mother. We do not need an invitation. We are family. She is trying to steal our home, and we demand to see her right now. Blood is blood, Catherine wailed loudly, trying to physically push past the security stanchions. You cannot keep a mother away from her daughter. Tell her to come down here and face us. Two large security guards immediately stepped forward, blocking their path to the elevator banks. The concierge picked up his phone, his eyes locked on the chaotic trio. William did not join their screaming. He had suddenly gone completely silent. He took a few steps backward, distancing himself from his hysterical wife and daughter. His eyes darted around the cavernous lobby. He stared at the specific veining in the marble pillars. He looked up at the custom geometric lighting fixtures suspended from the ceiling. His breathing grew shallow and rapid. He walked over to a massive brushed bronze plaque mounted on the far wall. The plaque detailed the recent renovations and the primary ownership group of the tower. William's hands began to shake uncontrollably as he read the polished letters. He recognized the address. He recognized the structural footprint of the building. 10 years ago, William had attempted a massive commercial real estate acquisition on this exact corner. He had over-leveraged his company, bought the land, and tried to build a high-rise. He failed miserably. He defaulted on the loans, lost the property to the bank, and spent years burying the humiliating loss to protect his pristine reputation. Now he stared at the plaque, the horrifying truth shattering his mind. This was his failed building. Natalie had not just rented a luxury penthouse. Her acquisitions firm had purchased the entire defaulted commercial tower from the bank years ago. She had taken his greatest, most humiliating failure, completely rebuilt it from the ground up, and turned it into the gleaming crown jewel of her massive empire. William traced the raised bronze lettering of my corporate holding company with a trembling finger, his breath catching in his throat. He looked like a man who had just watched his own ghost walk past. While he stood paralyzed by the magnitude of his failure, his wife and his favored daughter continued their shrill assault on my lobby staff. "Call her right now!" Brittany shrieked, slamming her palm against the polished mahogany desk. She leaned over the counter, her eyes wild and bloodshot. "You tell Natalie that her blood family is down here. We are not leaving until she comes down and fixes this mess. She is stealing our house. She owes us." The lead concierge did not even blink. He maintained a perfectly neutral expression, adjusting his earpiece. "I assure you, ma'am," he said evenly, "my employer owes you nothing, and if you do not lower your voice, I will have security escort you out of the building." Catherine burst into a theatrical wail. She clutched her cashmere coat tightly around her shoulders, dramatically swaying on her feet. "How dare you speak to us this way?" she sobbed, throwing a desperate look around the empty lobby to see if anyone was watching her performance. "We are her parents. We gave her life." A soft melodic chime echoed through the cavernous space. The brushed steel doors of the private executive elevator slid open seamlessly. I stepped out onto the marble floor. I wore a tailored crimson suit that cost more than William's first car, and my heels clicked with measured authority against the stone. I walked slowly toward the reception desk, flanking myself with two towering personal security guards. The moment they saw me, Catherine and Brittany froze. The sheer volume of their screaming died instantly, replaced by a sudden, suffocating silence. Even William turned away from the bronze plaque, his face a mask of pale horror. "You demanded an audience," I said, coming to a halt 10 feet away from them. I crossed my arms, staring down at the pathetic trio. "Speak quickly. I have an international conference call in exactly 4 minutes, and you are currently trespassing on my private property." Catherine lunged forward, pushing past a security guard who firmly held out his arm to stop her. She fell to her knees right there on the lobby floor, clasping her hands together in a posture of absolute supplication. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. "Natalie, my sweet, beautiful girl," Catherine cried out, her voice trembling with manufactured agony. "Please, you have to stop this madness. You cannot take our home. We are your family. I love you so much. I have always loved both of my daughters equally." We made mistakes, but a mother's love is unconditional. You cannot throw your own mother into the street. We are bound by blood. I stared down at her weeping form, feeling absolutely nothing. The performance was flawless, honed by decades of manipulating country club socialites and wealthy donors. But I knew the truth behind the tears. Save the theatrics, Catherine, I replied, my voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. You do not love me. You never loved me. You loved the aesthetic of having a family, but you only ever truly cared about Brittany. Do not talk to me about a mother's unconditional love. You didn't love me when I had to walk 3 miles in the snow to my high school graduation because you were busy taking Brittany to a luxury spa day. You told me to bundle up and left me to freeze because her pores were congested. Catherine choked on her fake sobs, her mouth falling open in shock. The specific memory hit her like a physical strike, shattering her victim narrative. William finally found his voice. He stepped away from the bronze plaque and walked toward me. His shoulders slumped. He looked around the soaring, magnificent lobby. You bought this building? He rasped, his tone hollow and utterly defeated. I lost this property to the bank 10 years ago. It was the worst financial disaster of my life. And you bought it. You took my failure and you built your empire on top of it. I bought it for a fraction of what you paid for it, I corrected smoothly. Because unlike you, William, I know how to calculate risk. I know how to build a foundation that does not rely on stealing from innocent people. You built a house of cards. I built a fortress. And now you are standing in my lobby, begging for the very wealth you spent my entire life telling me I was too worthless to ever achieve. Brittany could not handle the shift in power. Her eyes darted wildly around the lobby, desperate for some kind of leverage, some way to assert her dominance. She noticed a small, intricately carved jade sculpture resting on a lighted pedestal near the entrance vestibule. It was an authentic Ming Dynasty artifact worth roughly $300,000 displayed behind a velvet rope. Her desperation morphed into sheer, unadulterated madness. If you are not going to give us the money you owe us, then I am taking what is mine by right, Brittany screamed. She shoved past the concierge desk and sprinted toward the display pedestal. Before anyone could stop her, Brittany vaulted over the velvet rope. She grabbed the priceless jade sculpture with both hands, tearing it off its weighted base. She let out a victorious manic laugh, clutching the artifact to her chest. I can pawn this for 50 grand tomorrow morning, she yelled, turning toward the glass exit doors. She never made it. The moment the jade sculpture lifted off the pressure-sensitive pedestal, warning sirens blared through the lobby. A blinding grid of red security lasers instantly activated across the ceiling. Before Brittany could take a single step toward the street, explosive bolts fired. Massive 2-inch thick solid steel blast doors dropped from the ceiling with a deafening crash, sealing the main exit. They slammed shut behind William and Catherine, instantly trapping all three of them inside the reinforced security vestibule. The heavy steel effectively caged them like rats in a trap. The heavy steel blast doors slammed into the reinforced concrete floor, sealing the vestibule. Red security lights pulsed. Brittany screamed, dropping the priceless jade sculpture. She grabbed the door handle, shaking it with manic energy, but it did not budge. They were sealed inside a transparent cage of bulletproof glass and solid steel displayed clearly for the entire lobby to see. I stepped back into my private elevator, the doors gliding shut to block out their muffled shouts. I rode the car up to the penthouse, my pulse steady, my mind remarkably clear. Walking into my primary viewing suite, I poured a cup of black coffee. I pulled up the security feeds on my monitors. The audio fed directly into my office speakers. I took a slow sip of my coffee, settling into my leather chair to watch the spectacular implosion of the Watson family. The panic in the vestibule had rapidly mutated into vicious cannibalistic rage. William was pacing the confined space like a rabid dog, his face a terrifying shade of purple. He spun around, pointing a trembling finger directly at Catherine's face. "You stupid, selfish woman," William roared. "You spent $3 million on emeralds while my company was drowning. If you had just liquidated those offshore accounts when the feds first started sniffing around, I could have covered the missing principal. I could have paid off the initial auditors. You hoarded jewelry while our entire legacy burned to the ground. Catherine backed against the bulletproof glass, her eyes wide with shock. Do not you dare put this on me, William, she shrieked. I secured those assets because I knew you were too weak to protect us. You let Winston play you for a fool. You signed the wire transfers. You took the laundering fee. You are the reason the IRS is seizing our home. Brittany stood between them, trembling violently. Stop fighting, she wailed, clutching her head. We are trapped in here. Natalie is going to have me arrested for grand larceny. You have to do something, Dad. You have to fix this. Catherine turned her vitriol onto her favored daughter with lightning speed. Her hand lashed out, slapping Brittany across the cheek with a sharp, echoing crack. Brittany stumbled backward, clutching her face in stunned silence. Fix this! Catherine screamed, her pristine composure entirely shattered. You are the reason we are in this cage. You married that smooth-talking fraud. You brought Winston into this house. You paraded his fake wealth around the country club while he was secretly destroying your father's business. You ruined this family, Brittany. You destroyed my life just to fund your pathetic designer wardrobe. I watched the monitor, my expression completely flat. The golden child, the beloved patriarch, and the flawless matriarch were tearing each other to pieces in a 10 by 10 glass box. There was no loyalty. There was no blood bond. There was only raw, unfiltered survival instinct. The moment their money vanished, their affection for one another evaporated with it. The flashing red lights of 3 police cruisers suddenly illuminated the street outside the lobby. 6 armed officers poured through the revolving doors, taking tactical positions around the sealed vestibule. They drew their weapons, pointing them through the glass at my terrified family. I set my coffee mug down, smoothed the lapels of my crimson suit, and stepped back into the elevator. It was time to end the show. When I arrived back in the lobby, the police captain was actively ordering William, Catherine, and Brittany to place their hands against the glass. The 3 of them were sobbing, completely humiliated, as the growing crowd watched from a safe distance. I approached the captain, flashing my corporate identification. I am the owner of the building, I stated calmly. Have my security chief raise the blast doors. They are unarmed. The heavy steel barricades slowly ground upward, revealing my shivering, broken family. The officers immediately moved in, grabbing Brittany by the arms and spinning her around. One officer pulled out a pair of steel handcuffs. Ma'am, you are under arrest for attempted grand larceny and destruction of private property, the officer announced, securing Brittany's wrists. Brittany screamed, thrashing wildly. Mom, help me. Dad, do not let them take me. I stepped forward, raising my hand. Release her, officer. I am declining to press charges. The captain frowned, looking at the discarded jade sculpture on the floor. You have clear evidence of attempted theft, Miss Watson. We can easily process this. I looked directly into Brittany's tear-streaked, terrified face. Throwing her in a county holding cell gives her a place to hide, I said. It gives her 3 square meals and a cot. That is entirely too generous. I want them to walk out of this building and step onto the street with absolutely nothing. I want them to feel the cold reality of the world they created. Release her. The officer hesitated, then unlocked the handcuffs. Brittany rubbed her wrists, staring at me with a mixture of terror and absolute hatred. The police escorted the 3 of them out of the building, forcefully directing them onto the bustling public sidewalk. William stared at the towering glass structure one last time, completely broken. Catherine pulled her coat tight, trying to hide her face from the onlookers. But Brittany was not finished. Fueled by pure, desperate spite, she pulled her smartphone from her pocket. She marched right up to the glass facade, glaring at me through the lobby windows. She hit the record button, instantly broadcasting live to her remaining thousands of Instagram followers. Look at this monster, Brittany screamed into her phone, crying massive fabricated tears for her audience. My sister, Natalie Watson, is an evil, heartless corporate slumlord. She is violently evicting her own parents from their home. She just threw her own flesh and blood onto the street to starve. She is a sociopath, and I am going to expose every single dark secret she has. Brittany held her phone high, framing her stained face against the gleaming glass facade of my building. Her voice pitched into a breathless, trembling register perfectly engineered for social media sympathy. The viewer count on her live stream skyrocketed, jumping from a few hundred to tens of thousands within minutes. People love a public breakdown. I stood comfortably inside the climate-controlled lobby, my arms crossed, watching her performance through the reinforced glass. She pointed a manicured finger at me, ensuring my crimson suit was visible in the background of her broadcast. "My sister is a monster!" Brittany sobbed to her audience, wiping at her smeared mascara. "She engineered a hostile takeover of my parents' home. She threw us out onto the street. And the worst part, the absolute most unforgivable part." Brittany paused, placing a protective, trembling hand over her perfectly flat stomach. "I am pregnant. I am expecting a child, and Natalie knows it. She threw her own pregnant sister out into the cold night. She is a billionaire corporate slumlord who preys on her own flesh and blood." The lie was breathtaking. Brittany was not pregnant. She had spent the entire morning complaining about her restrictive diet and drinking champagne. But the internet did not know that. The live feed exploded with furious comments. Heart emojis and angry faces flooded the screen. Users demanded justice, calling for my businesses to be boycotted. William and Catherine immediately realized the angle she was playing. They crowded into the frame, adopting expressions of profound, tragic despair. Catherine leaned her head on Brittany's shoulder, weeping audibly for the camera. William glared at the camera. I did not tap on the glass or step outside to defend myself. Engaging with a hysterical narcissist was a losing strategy. Instead, I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed my lead public relations director. The team had been on standby since the eviction notices were served, anticipating a chaotic fallout. I watched Brittany. "She is live on Instagram," I said smoothly, watching Brittany gesture dramatically toward my security guards. "She just claimed she is pregnant and homeless. The viewer count is climbing fast. It is time to drop the files." "Understood," my director replied instantly. "The press release is fully prepped. We are linking the public court dockets and broadcasting them directly to every major news outlet in the city. We will also seed the links into the comments section of her live stream." "Do it," I commanded. "Release everything. The federal indictments, the IRS audits the financial records. Leave absolutely nothing to the imagination." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The retaliation was entirely digital, silent, and overwhelmingly lethal. My firm did not issue a pathetic apology. We simply distributed the cold, hard facts. Within 60 seconds, the digital guillotine dropped. My PR team flooded the internet with the unsealed federal indictments against Winston. They released the detailed fraud charges against William, outlining his desperate attempt to leverage his home for an illegal offshore Ponzi scheme. They dropped the IRS audit notices, proving Catherine had been hiding undeclared assets. Then my team delivered the final blow, specifically tailored for Brittany. They leaked a comprehensive dossier of her digital and financial history. They published receipts showing she spent thousands purchasing fake followers to artificially inflate her influencer status. They released credit card statements, proving her designer handbags were cheap imitations purchased from illicit overseas vendors. The illusion of her flawless, wealthy lifestyle was systematically dismantled and broadcast to the exact audience she was trying to manipulate. I watched the shift happen in real time. Brittany was still weeping into the camera, entirely oblivious to the digital avalanche crashing down on her carefully constructed world. Then the comments section on her live stream abruptly changed tone. The sympathetic emojis vanished. The calls for my cancellation stopped. Instead, users began pasting links to the federal court documents. "Wait, your husband is facing 20 years for a Ponzi scheme," one user wrote. Another comment rapidly scrolled past. "Fake bags, fake followers, and a fake pregnancy. You are literally married to a federal criminal." The chat became a relentless torrent of mockery and exposure. Brittany squinted at her screen, her fake tears drying up instantly. Her jaw dropped as she read the incoming barrage of truth. The panic in her eyes was authentic now. She frantically tapped the screen, trying to delete the comments, but the flood was unstoppable. Her perfect victim narrative had collapsed in under 3 minutes. "Turn it off," William barked, finally looking down at his own buzzing phone. "Brittany, turn that camera off right now. The news networks are picking this up." He was too late. The viral nature of Brittany's broadcast combined with the explosive release of famous federal indictments acted like a beacon. Two local news vans careened around the corner, their tires squealing on the pavement. The broadcast crews poured out, hauling heavy cameras and glaring spotlights. But they did not rush toward Brittany to ask about her fabricated pregnancy. A determined reporter shoved a microphone directly into William's face. "William Watson, local news channel 5. Can you comment on the federal fraud charges unsealed against you this evening? Did you intentionally leverage your family estate to fund illegal offshore trading?" William recoiled, shielding his face like a cornered criminal. "No comment," he shouted, trying to push through the aggressive media throng. "Get those cameras out of my face." Catherine stood paralyzed in the flashing lights of the news cameras. The majestic facade of my building loomed behind her. Her cell phone chimed loudly. She pulled it out with shaking hands. I watched through the glass as she read the incoming email. Her eyes widened in absolute horror. It was an urgent, automated message from the exclusive Heritage Country Club. The board of directors had held an emergency vote. Her membership was publicly and permanently revoked, effective immediately, citing conduct unbecoming of their elite establishment. Catherine stared at her phone screen, her manicured fingers trembling so violently she nearly dropped the device. The email from the Heritage Country Club board of directors was a death sentence. Her membership, fiercely guarded as her ultimate symbol of social superiority, was terminated. Conduct unbecoming. The words burned into her retinas. This was complete social exile. Catherine turned on her heel, pushed past a bewildered cameraman, and marched toward the street. She hailed a passing taxi, throwing herself inside. She barked the address of the Heritage Country Club at the driver, her voice sharp. She was going to fix this. She would march into the clubhouse, demand an audience with the board, and force them to retract the email. 30 minutes later, the taxi sped up the winding driveway of the Heritage Country Club. Catherine threw a crumpled bill at the driver and practically sprinted toward the massive mahogany front doors. The valet attendant stepped forward, his polite smile faltering as he registered her chaotic appearance. She shoved right past him, ignoring his attempt to speak. The main dining room was a sanctuary of quiet wealth. Catherine stormed into the room, her heels clicking aggressively, instantly shattering the serene atmosphere. Conversations abruptly halted. Wealthy women lowered their designer sunglasses, whispering behind their hands as they observed her smeared makeup. Catherine ignored their stares. Her eyes frantically scanned the room until she spotted her target. In the most exclusive alcove of the dining room, elevated slightly above the rest of the floor, sat the club's board of directors. They were having a private high-stakes business lunch. Catherine recognized the board president immediately. She squared her shoulders, marching straight toward the alcove with absolute terrifying entitlement. "Listen to me right now," Catherine shouted, her voice cutting through the quiet dining room like a siren. She stormed up the 2 short steps into the private alcove, slamming her purse down onto their table. Silverware rattled. A waiter dropped a pitcher in shock. "You cannot do this to me. I received your cowardly little email and I absolutely refuse to accept it. You cannot revoke my membership over a ridiculous media misunderstanding. I am a foundational pillar of this establishment. I have chaired the spring gala for 5 consecutive years." The board president, an imposing man with silver hair, set his napkin down on the table. He looked at Catherine with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Mrs. Watson, your presence here is a direct violation of your termination notice," he stated coldly. "I suggest you lower your voice and leave the premises immediately before we are forced to involve the authorities." "I am not going anywhere until you reinstate my access," Catherine shrieked, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "My husband is dealing with false allegations, and my son-in-law is targeted by a federal witch hunt. You cannot punish me for their mistakes. I demand to know who initiated this vote. Who authorized my removal? I did." The calm, razor-sharp voice came from the head of the table. Catherine froze. Her breath caught in her throat. She slowly turned her head toward the voice, her eyes widening in absolute terror. Sitting at the head of the table, flanked by the city's most powerful executives, was me. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap. I wore a tailored navy blazer and a serene expression. I had watched her entire manic performance without blinking. Catherine staggered backward, bumping into a serving cart. "What are you doing here?" she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "You cannot be here. This is a private board lunch. You are not a member of this club." "You really have not learned your lesson about making assumptions, Catherine," I replied. "I am not just a member. I am the primary silent benefactor of the Heritage Country Club's expansion project. My acquisitions firm entirely funded the new golf course. The board extended me an honorary executive chair 3 years ago. I simply never bothered to attend the social events because I found the company incredibly tedious." Catherine stared at me, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly. The absolute totality of her defeat washed over her. She had rushed here to save her social standing only to discover that I owned the very ground she was standing on. "You orchestrated this," she breathed, her hands shaking. "You had them expel me." "You expelled yourself," I countered, my voice sharp. "The board has a strict moral turpitude clause. Having federal agents raid your husband's business and being exposed on national television as a tax-evading fraud violates that clause. I simply brought the evidence to the board's attention this morning." Catherine looked frantically at the other board members, searching for any sign of sympathy. She found nothing but cold, judging stares. She had spent her entire life stepping on people to climb the social ladder, and now there was absolutely no one left to catch her when she fell. "Please," Catherine begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "Please, Natalie. This club is all I have left. You took the house. You destroyed William's company. You ruined Brittany's reputation. Do not take this away from me. I will do whatever you want." The board president turned to me, clearly repulsed by the scene unfolding in his dining room. He leaned slightly toward my chair. "Miss Watson," he asked politely, "should we have security remove this woman?" I looked my mother dead in the eye. I watched the last shred of her arrogant pride crumble into dust. I felt no pity. I had spent 30 years being treated like a disposable asset, a tool to be discarded the moment I inconvenienced her perfect, curated life. "Yes," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the alcove. "She does not belong at this table." The board president gestured to the security guards. Catherine shrieked as they seized her arms, physically escorting her out. The quiet hum of the climate-controlled air in my corner office felt like a victory lap after the deafening spectacle at the country club. I sat behind my obsidian desk, watching the Boston skyline transition to early dusk. The city below was completely unaware of the decimation of the Watson legacy playing out behind closed doors. My intercom buzzed, a sharp sound piercing the silence. My executive assistant spoke, her tone perfectly neutral. "Your father is here. He does not have an appointment, but he is insisting it is a matter of urgency." "Send him in," I commanded. The heavy door swung open and William Watson stepped inside. I almost did not recognize the man crossing my threshold. The formidable patriarch who had dictated my childhood with a booming voice had entirely vanished. In his place stood a broken, hollowed-out shell. His expensive, tailored suit hung loosely on his shrinking frame, deeply wrinkled, as though he had slept in it for days. His skin possessed a grayish pallor, and his hands trembled violently as he gripped the chair opposite my desk. He did not wait for an invitation to sit. He collapsed into the leather seat, exhaling a ragged breath. I said nothing. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to stew in the humiliation of his current reality. He looked around the expansive office, taking in the panoramic views, the artwork, and the undeniable proof of the empire I had built entirely without his money. "They are going to indict me on Friday," William said, his voice a raspy, defeated whisper. "The feds raided the downtown offices this morning. They seized the servers, the filing cabinets, everything. My attorneys told me the offshore accounts are fully exposed. The money laundering, the wire fraud, the fabricated equity loans. It is all out in the open. I am looking at a minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary." I kept my expression entirely flat, offering absolutely no sympathy. "Actions have consequences, William. You built a house of cards on top of stolen money. Gravity always collects its due." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple visibly bobbing in his throat. I know I am finished. I am clearly not here to ask you to save me. I know you will not do that. I know you want to see me burn. But I have a proposition for you, Natalie. A business arrangement. A business arrangement, I repeated, raising a single eyebrow. You have absolutely no assets, your accounts are frozen, and your reputation is a toxic liability. What exactly do you think you have to offer me in a business arrangement? William leaned forward, planting his elbows on his knees, his eyes desperate and wide. I can protect the family name. I can end the media circus. I am willing to take the fall entirely. I will sign a full confession, taking sole responsibility for the financial crimes. I will tell the prosecutors that Winston was a naive pawn, that I orchestrated the entire Ponzi scheme. I will testify against him if they want, but I will make sure the narrative firmly states that I acted alone. It will cleanly resolve the federal case and get the news vans off your doorstep. I will fall on my sword. And what is the price for this noble sacrifice? I asked, my voice dripping with cold sarcasm. He hesitated, his bloodshot eyes dropping to the polished floor, before forcing himself to look directly at me again. I need you to set up an irrevocable trust fund for Brittany. She needs $2 million heavily protected from the federal asset forfeiture so she can relocate and start over. Her reputation is ruined here. Winston is going to drag her down with him. She needs a clean slate. I will plead guilty to everything and rot in a federal cell, but you have to guarantee that Brittany is financially secure. A cold, dark laugh escaped my lips, echoing sharply against the glass walls of my office. I stood up, bracing my hands flat against the polished obsidian desktop, leaning over to look directly into his pathetic, bloodshot eyes. You are still trying to save the golden child? I stated, my voice dropping to a lethal, quiet register. Even when you are staring at a prison cell, you only care about her. She is fragile, Natalie. William pleaded, his voice breaking. She cannot survive this kind of pressure. She simply does not know how to work. You are strong, you always were. You survived without us. You thrived. Brittany will shatter into a million pieces if she is left with nothing. Please, she is your sister. She is a parasite, I countered, cutting him off instantly. She spent her entire life mocking my ambition while siphoning your bank accounts dry. You bought her cars, you bought her designer wardrobes, you funded her fake influencer lifestyle. You handed her the world on a silver platter, and she used it to spit on me. And yet here you sit, facing the absolute destruction of your life, facing a decade behind bars, and your final request is not for yourself. It is not an apology to me for decades of neglect. It is a desperate beg to fund her delusions one last time. You are truly pathetic. William reached out his trembling hand, hovering over the desk. I am begging you, Natalie. It is the only leverage I have left, my confession for her future. I slowly opened my top desk drawer and pulled out a small, sleek silver object. I placed it on the desk and pushed it forward with my index finger. The object glided across the smooth obsidian surface, stopping exactly 1 inch from William's trembling hands. It was a silver USB drive. You don't have anything to trade, Dad. I already paid Winston's mistress for his recordings. Winston flipped to the feds yesterday. He gave them everything on you to get a plea deal. William stared at the small silver drive resting on the obsidian desktop. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw slackened. The grand sacrifice he had planned, the martyr routine designed to guilt me into funding Brittany, evaporated into the climate-controlled air of my office. He reached out with a trembling hand, his fingers hovering over the drive before pulling back as if the metal burned him. Winston had already given them everything. There was no deal to be made. You have nothing left to sell, I stated, my voice devoid of any inflection. The auction ended yesterday. You should leave before building security escorts you out. William did not argue. He did not yell. He pushed himself up from the chair with the slow, agonizing movements of a man who had just aged 20 years in 20 seconds. He turned and shuffled out of my office, a hollow shell of the patriarch who had once demanded total submission. The federal hammer dropped less than 12 hours later. At 6 in the morning, a fleet of black tactical vehicles tore through the wrought iron gates of the Watson estate. I watched the live feed from the security cameras I had legally installed on the perimeter. Dozens of federal agents swarmed the manicured lawns, their windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the IRS. They did not knock politely. A tactical team breached the front doors with a heavy battering ram, the sharp crack of splintering mahogany echoing through the audio feed. My planned foreclosure eviction was rendered entirely moot. The federal government was executing a total asset forfeiture. Agents poured into the foyer, fanning out across the massive house. They seized everything: computers, filing cabinets, artwork, and the keys to William's luxury sedans. Catherine was dragged out of her master's suite, wearing her silk robe, screaming at the agents to unhand her. An agent calmly handed William a federal warrant detailing the seizure of the property, the frozen bank accounts, and the immediate confiscation of all physical assets believed to be purchased with laundered funds. They were given exactly 15 minutes to pack whatever personal clothing they could fit into 2 standard suitcases. Catherine sobbed hysterically as she shoved designer dresses into a bag, only for an agent to coldly inform her that any item valued over $1,000 remained the property of the federal government. She was forced to leave behind her furs, her emeralds, and her dignity. William stood in the driveway in his pajamas, watching silently as federal tape was slapped across the front doors of his ruined kingdom. With their accounts completely frozen and their credit cards immediately declined, William and Catherine had nowhere to turn. Their country club friends ignored their frantic phone calls. The high society elite who had gladly drank their vintage wine now treated them like a highly contagious disease. By nightfall, the former kings of Beacon Hill were forced to check into a run-down, grimy motel on the outskirts of the city, paying for a single night with the crumpled cash William had managed to pull from his money clip. They sat on a stained mattress, listening to the roar of highway traffic, entirely destitute. Brittany was faring much worse. She had retreated to a cheap hotel, desperately clinging to her fabricated pregnancy narrative on social media. She posted tearful videos claiming the stress of my cruelty was threatening her unborn child. She waited for her loyal followers to rally behind her to demand justice for the wronged expecting mother. Instead, the final devastating blow came from the man she had married. Winston, desperate to shave years off his impending prison sentence, threw his wife directly under the speeding bus. His defense attorneys released a public statement outlining the terms of his plea agreement. Winston claimed that he was merely a victim of Brittany's insatiable pathological greed. He provided federal prosecutors with text messages, emails, and recorded arguments proving that Brittany had orchestrated the massive spending sprees. He claimed she blackmailed him, threatening to ruin his reputation if he did not siphon funds from William's company to support her lavish lifestyle. The ultimate kill shot was Winston's formal declaration regarding her condition. His lawyers provided medical records proving Winston had undergone a permanent sterilization procedure 3 years prior. It was biologically impossible for him to father a child. The internet ruthlessly consumed the revelation. Brittany's social media accounts became a digital war zone. Her followers, realizing they had been manipulated with a fake pregnancy, turned on her with vicious, unfiltered fury. Sponsors publicly severed ties. Brands issued statements condemning her fraudulent behavior. Brittany was universally despised, branded a manipulative, greedy liar who had ruined her own family for designer shoes. Her entire identity, built on adoration and envy, was pulverized. I worked late into the evening finalizing the acquisition of a new commercial property. The storm outside had been raging for hours, hurling sheets of freezing rain against the thick glass of my penthouse office. The city was a blur of distorted lights and gray shadows. I gathered my coat, checked my phone one last time, and took my private elevator down to the lobby level. My driver was waiting at the curb with a black umbrella. I pushed through the revolving glass doors, the freezing wind instantly biting at my cheeks. The rain was deafening, bouncing off the pavement and creating deep rushing puddles in the gutters. I stepped under the umbrella, preparing to enter the warmth of the waiting town car. Natalie. The voice was weak, barely audible over the roaring storm. I stopped and turned my head. Standing just outside the glow of the lobby lights, completely exposed to the freezing downpour, was Brittany. She wore no coat. Her clothes were plastered to her shivering frame, completely soaked through. Her blonde hair, normally styled to absolute perfection, hung in stringy, wet clumps across her face. Brittany stood completely soaked outside my building, the freezing rain masking whatever tears she had left. I stepped under the large umbrella held by my driver and looked at the woman who spent a lifetime making me feel invisible. She wore a cheap trench coat. Her hands were shaking violently as she stepped closer, flinching when my guard shifted his weight. I simply watched her. Winston took everything, Brittany choked out. He froze. Our accounts. His lawyers served me divorce papers, and I cannot afford a room. I have nowhere to go. I pulled my coat tighter, my face indifferent. That sounds like a consequence of your actions, Brittany. You spent 30 years riding our parents' coattails. What do you expect me to do? I need a job, she sobbed, wrapping her arms around herself. I will do anything, Natalie. I will clean toilets. I will scrub floors. Just please give me a job. I have no skills. I have no money. I have no husband. I am begging you. I stared at her pathetic, shivering form. My mind flashed back to my junior year of college. I was desperately studying for final exams to maintain my scholarship. You had just come home wearing a dress costing more than my tuition. You grabbed the plate of spaghetti I had made and dumped it onto the floor. Do you remember what you told me that night? I asked, my voice cutting through the noise of the storm. Brittany blinked, her mascara-stained eyes widening in confusion. What? You told me to clean it up, I said with cold precision. You laughed and said I should get used to cleaning your messes. You told me my degree was useless and that I would end up working as a janitor. A fresh wave of tears spilled down Brittany's cheeks. She lowered her head, the shame finally visibly crushing her. I was wrong, she whimpered. I was so wrong about everything. Please, Natalie, I am starving. I turned toward my car. I will not make you a janitor, I stated. You would be terrible. I own a property firm. They need a receptionist. It pays minimum wage. You will sign a strict non-disclosure agreement. You will receive 0 family privileges, 0 advances, and 0 special treatment. Do you want it? Brittany nodded frantically, her wet hair slapping against her face. Yes, she gasped. Thank you. Thank you, Natalie. I accept. Report to the Human Resources Department on the 3rd floor tomorrow at 8 in the morning, I commanded. Do not be late. I slid into the warm leather seat of my car, shutting the heavy door and leaving her standing alone in the freezing rain. Exactly 1 year later, the harsh consequences had reshaped our universe. It was Thanksgiving Day. Inside Grandma Rose's fully restored house, the atmosphere was vibrant. I had transformed the property into a stunning sanctuary honoring her memory. The oak floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and the scent of roasted turkey and fresh bread filled the air. I hosted my chosen family. My loyal friends, mentors, and colleagues sat around a mahogany table sharing incredible food and genuine laughter. There was no artificial posturing or toxic competition. We simply celebrated mutual respect and genuine affection. Miles away from our joyous celebration, the members of my former family were experiencing a very different kind of Thanksgiving. Catherine wore a stained uniform, standing behind the host stand at a diner. Her feet ached in cheap shoes as she forced a humiliating smile for loud tourists. She spent her holiday clearing dirty plates for meager tips erased from the elite society she once ruled. William ate his Thanksgiving meal off a plastic tray in the sterile cafeteria of a federal prison. He wore a standard jumpsuit. He sat alone at a metal table, staring blankly with 14 years left on his sentence. Brittany sat behind a bleak desk in the fluorescent lobby of my subsidiary firm. She wore a cheap headset, aggressively typing data while answering angry tenant complaints. She ate a cold sandwich from a vending machine, glancing at the clock, desperate for her long shift to end. Back at the beautifully illuminated dining table, I tapped my silver fork against my crystal wine glass. The room immediately quieted, the smiling faces of my true family turning toward me in anticipation. I want to thank all of you for being here, I began. Family is not defined by blood. It is defined by loyalty, by support, and by the courage to stand together when the world tries to tear you down. You have all been my foundation. I reached into my blazer pocket and withdrew a thick legal document bound in a blue cover. I placed it directly onto the mahogany table. My lead corporate attorney, who was sitting to my right, handed me a gold fountain pen. My grandfather always said that wealth is only valuable if it builds a better future. I continued unscapping the pen. Today, I am taking the final step to ensure that my legacy serves a purpose greater than blind greed. With a swift, decisive motion, I signed my name at the bottom of the contract. This document irrevocably transfers my entire corporate empire and personal wealth into an impenetrable trust, I announced. The trust is strictly dedicated to funding business grants and legal support for disadvantaged women. My friends erupted into cheers. By executing that signature, I legally locked my toxic bloodline out of my wealth forever. They could never claim a single cent. My empire would empower women who needed a lifeline, not parasites looking for a handout. I picked up my crystal glass of vintage red wine, holding it up toward the chandelier. I looked at the supportive people surrounding me, feeling profound peace settle deep into my bones. The dark shadows of my past were permanently erased. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The revenge was complete, absolute, and perfectly sweet.